you will remember that there are three functional types of nerve cells. Nerve cells that either conduct information to the brain or the spinal cord, those are afferent nerves. All right? They will form the afferent parts of the peripheral nervous system. The type of information that the afferent neurons are carrying toward the brain and the spinal cord would be sensory information. Sensory information is any kind of information that we have a conscious awareness of. Like if I touch something hot, I can feel the burn. I can feel that something's cold, I can feel a touch. Okay, that's sensory information that originates in some kind of receptor, and carries that information to the brain. That's what afferent neurons do. Efferent neurons, okay, let's go with the interneurons. The interneurons or association neurons are what make up the brain and the spinal cord. They're the neurons that do the thinking and everything else that the brain does. Okay, those are interneurons, association neurons. So the other two types of neurons are either carrying information to the association neurons of the brain and spinal cord, or once the brain and the spinal cord process that information, then sends out a directive as to what to do, then the efferent neurons are carrying the information from the brain and spinal cord to the muscles and glands that can effect a response to the stimulus. Okay? So if you look at how all of that happens, then that's all reflected in the organization of the nervous system. All right, so in particular, that's what this is saying. The nervous system has two major divisions called the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system is composed of neurons that are completely within the brain and spinal cord. Their axons, their dendrites, their nerve cell bodies are completely within either the brain or completely within the spinal cord. If a neuron is not completely within the brain or the spinal cord, then it must be a part of the peripheral nervous system. And at the same time, it must be either an afferent neuron or an efferent neuron. Okay? Now, the higher order functions are carried out by the brain, which is made of which of the three types of neurons makes up the brain? What?
Efferent and interneurons.
We're working. Afferent neurons. Okay. What kind of neurons make up the brain or the spinal cord? The interneurons or association neurons. Okay. Now, the peripheral nervous system will be made up of neurons that are either totally outside of the brain or the spinal cord or partially outside of the brain or the spinal cord. In other words, their nerve cell body might be in the spinal cord, but their axons might reach outside of the spinal cord, okay? And so those neurons will be a part of the peripheral nervous system. Now, what type of neurons are located outside of the brain or the spinal cord? Well, either afferent neurons or efferent neurons. The afferent neurons are outside of the brain and the spinal cord, but they are carrying information to the brain or spinal cord. The brain and the spinal cord has association neurons that process the information. We called the storage of information memory. We call the ability to be aware of things in the environment perception. We call the processing that goes on that solves problems and comes up with a response to a stimulus. Call that thinking. And then we have another kind of function that's kind of hard to pinpoint that involves emotions. That's called affective behavior. All right? And with all that processing, the brain is the central processing unit of the computer. And the brain does all of that processing. It decides upon an action to be taken on the incoming information. In order to decide on what action, we call that thinking. Okay, so when the brain is processing the information to decide how to respond to a stimulus, we call that thinking. Now, thinking gets to be very complex, but thinking also involves comparing stored information with the new incoming information. What do we call the stored information? Memory. Okay? And so to process new information, the brain compares the old with the new, all right, to make a decision as to what's going on at the moment. You can really see this take place when you understand how we see things, how vision works, okay? As illustrated by the white or gold dress or the black or blue dress, okay? The brain doesn't see everything. I mean, it's there to be seen, but the brain doesn't focus on everything. The brain just picks out certain features. That's called feature extraction. And it'll look at a little bit here, a little bit there, and wherever the memory comes in, where have I seen that before? Okay, so it must be this. All right, that's the processing that the brain does. I might have indicated this before, but there are optical illusions. You could see me take a yardstick and measure 2 lines. And you could watch me measure it so that they are equal. You know that they're equal. But if I put an arrowhead like this and like this on one line and an inverted arrowhead like this, same kind of arrowhead, just in a different location. Now, what does that do to the lines in the middle that you would have just watched me measure? Do they look the same? They don't, because the brain is comparing what it knew from before to what it's looking at now. Okay? And what the brain is saying, okay, well, where have I seen this pattern before? Okay, how about whenever I look at a corner that's far away from it, all right? When I look at how the ceiling meets this corner, it looks like this kind of pattern. But when I see a corner that's closer to me, like this corner, then that looks like coming down like this, okay? And so the brain, in its processing, says, okay, these lines cannot be the same length because this is closer to me and this is further away from me. Okay, so they can't be the same length. So to look like they're the same length, this must be longer and this must be shorter. Okay? You do the same test to people who live in roundhouses and what have you. They see it for what it is. All right? Because their brains don't have that past experience to match up with. They don't have that memory to help them reach the wrong conclusion in this case. All right? Okay. So the point was that all of that processing called thinking and being aware of things, awareness is another thing, consciousness.
Being repeated, so it's neurons that release.
All right, you're not conscious of anything. You're not aware of anything until cells of the cortex, the outer part of the, big part of the brain are stimulated, okay? Again, when you stimulate the back part of the cortex, then your consciousness will see something, or stimulate, the hearing section, etc. You'll hear things. Now, the rest of the nervous system is either going to be bringing information to the brain or the spinal cord, or getting information from the brain or the spinal cord after the brain has processed the information. But then when the brain has processed the information, it needs to bring about some type of action. The brain is just the brain. It can't walk, it can't move, it's just there to think and carry on. So how does the brain bring about action? Well, by sending a message over outgoing efferent neurons. These outgoing efferent neurons are going to stimulate some type of muscle or some type of gland. It will be muscles and glands that will bring about the action, the response to a stimulus, okay? We're just beginning to learn that there are three kinds of muscles. Involuntary muscle, cardiac muscle is involuntary muscle. All right, visceral muscle is involuntary muscle. Involuntary means you cannot think about moving this kind of muscle and make it move.